think maybe a parallel here might be art. It's entirely possible to pass by a beautiful painting and notice that it has a particular color or particular hue. But when you gaze upon art, when you spend time with it, you begin to notice its subtleties. And the very same thing is true with faith.
All right. I would like to introduce my guest, Father Pete. He is an esteemed priest, scholar, and mentor. With a deep devotion to theology and philosophy, Father Pete has become a guiding light within the Holy Cross and Notre Dame community and beyond. And I would like you guys to join us as we explore and gain insights from his wisdom. Father Pete, thank you so much for joining. The first thing
I appreciate the invite. This is awesome.
First question, I just want to ask a little bit about you. Can you tell us about your background and what led you to become a member of the Holy Cross congregation and do what you do now?
Yeah, so I originally from Grand Rapids, Michigan. I went to a place called Grand Valley State University up in Allendale, Michigan, which is just outside of GR, and studied biology there. And then the entire time, though, I was thinking about priesthood. And so even though I was pursuing the biological sciences and maybe being a teacher or a doctor, the whole time I kept coming back to this vocational call that I had to serve as a priest. And so when I decided that it was finally time to take the time and give it a look, I thought to myself, I really don't know where to start. And so I had a friend of mine who was actually a part of the Holy Cross congregation. And my mom literally said, like, why don't you check out Notre Dame? Why don't you see if that might be a possibility? And really the rest, as they say, is history. So thank goodness my friend was here, or else I would have ended up elsewhere. So it was a great moment of trusting God that God would provide. And certainly that is the case.
And what do you feel like is special about Notre Dame that you've stayed for so long?
Yeah, there's so much that's special. I think that the mission of the university is quite beautiful in so many respects. This deep Catholic tradition that very much tries to bring the gospel to the modern age. You think about the way that Notre Dame enters into a variety of different spheres, whether this be academic, whether this be athletic, but also hoping, as our founder, Father Soren, once said, to be a force for good throughout the country, and frankly, world. And so when that all comes together in a meaningful way, Notre Dame is very much trying to bring Catholicism and demonstrating how the teachings of Jesus 2,000 years after his life, death, and resurrection still invite us to consider how we might live in a way that is according to what he invited his disciples then to. And so it's a fun space to be in, to kind of take people from a variety of different backgrounds and perspectives and bring them all together under this mission out of a great love for the dignity of each person, but also to be able to kind of come to understand the beauty that is within, and then therefore the call that sends us back out into the world.
One thing I want to ask you, and this is something that I think you know very well, working with college students, is that
Yeah.
especially today with technology and digital age and just it being really hard to find faith as a young person, I'm wondering if you had any advice for any of the young people listening to this podcast on like how would you advise younger people to deepen their faith and explore that? And how have you seen that transform in Notre Dame's campus?
My number one piece of advice on this is really quite straightforward. Oftentimes people are concerned in some way, shape, and form with doubt, or perhaps the questions that they have, as if somehow, if they were to ask these questions, it might suggest that they are critical of faith. And when that moment arises, my invitation is like, seek out the person that you trust the most, the person that you feel is most wise or capable of answering that question, and enter into a meaningful dialogue. Faith is one of those things that it grows when really fully engaged, but regrettably it atrophies when not. And I think it's one of these moments where we have to allow ourselves the space, the creativity, the curiosity to engage it meaningfully, because then it allows for us to take in new perspectives. I think maybe a parallel here might be art. It's entirely possible to pass by a beautiful painting and notice that it has a particular color or particular hue. But when you gaze upon art, when you spend time with it, you begin to notice its subtleties. And the very same thing is true with faith. But I think in our hurried society, and you mentioned earlier in terms of social media, we live in a society that's so fast paced. Like if it exceeds 25 seconds, on our feed, we're like, I don't know that I got time. And faith isn't going to flourish in that. And so we have to intentionally slow things down so that we can actually pick up on the subtleties of what it possesses. But interestingly enough, in life, the subtleties oftentimes are where true joy and meaning are found.
And what would you say are the biggest challenges or barriers stopping young people from, you know, hearing the word of Jesus and, wanting to explore their faith? I have come to know it as maybe there's a difference between generations.
Yeah.
Like one generation of people
Yeah.
maybe are looking for love. Some would say like this generation is kind of looking for truth. What would you say is sort of like the biggest barrier right now?
It's funny you mentioned truth, because I think for this generation, irrelevance tends to be the word that arises, and I think the question becomes, it falls under the category of thoughts and prayers. So people are like, yeah, yeah, yeah. A tragedy occurs, thoughts and prayers, thoughts and prayers, and we've moved into kind of this space where it's like, well, what does that really do? That's what people say when they have no other thing to say. But and on one hand, I get where they're coming from, but I think that's a classic scenario where you kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater. And we have to allow ourselves to really kind of dig more deeply and ask ourselves, like, what are these inner yearnings and longings? I mean, to be a human being is to grapple with the divine in some way, shape, or form, and to allow that aspect of ourselves to just kind of languish and be unattended to will have consequences. I don't know what they are. I don't profess to know that in its entirety, but I think that we owe ourselves, and this is what I believe is so powerful about a life of faith, that the moment of conversion is never far away. You don't need to kind of like get online and sign up for Faith Plus or Catholic Plus to kickstart it. It's a moment of saying, yes, Lord. It's a moment of saying, I am willing. It's a moment of saying, I am open. There's this great phrase that I love, that, when the student is ready, the master appears. And I think that there's a posture of us perhaps remaining open uh, to seeing what faith might be able to offer us. And then we begin to see suitable guides and insights that we otherwise wouldn't have picked up on. And we begin to go down a path perhaps we otherwise wouldn't have pursued.
And you have a lot of experience being at Notre Dame, working with younger people, perhaps mentoring them in some capacity. What advice would you give to other people who want to mentor others in faith? Or like just what have you found to be things that you would like to tell others when walking with others in their faith journey?
Yeah, I think it really starts with compassion. The older I get, the more I believe compassion is an absolute essential. And I think compassion runs in two lanes, but are always parallel with one another. The first is compassion towards oneself. In our lives, we don't always get things right. Sometimes we jump to conclusions, and sometimes we have perspectives that are erroneous. And so, to have compassion as we come to a deeper sense of truth and understanding, that's very important. But it's just as important to be compassionate towards another person's circumstance. And I think one of the mistakes I've made in my own life is that with my own intellect and capacity, not to say that I'm the greatest of all time, but it's one of those scenarios where, once you learn enough about a particular circumstance, you think you can just skip steps and you can jump to conclusions. So the times in which I've done that, I failed to be compassionate. I failed to be understanding of the circumstance of another person. And as a result, I make decisions or behave and act in a way that doesn't actually allow for the fullness of the truth to be revealed to me, so that I can actually be a part of a broader kind of building of the kingdom of God, if you will. So I really think that when it comes to what I encourage for people is, one, as you're thinking about your own story and your own journey, try to be compassionate towards yourself. That God doesn't waste a moment. There's no moment that's wasted here. That there's always, and think about our own lives, right? Like typically it's the biggest mistakes that oftentimes are the greatest teachers. But yet, as you're reflecting, to have compassion, but also just as important, we live in a society that seemingly just enjoys burning people to the ground. Some will call it the
Yeah.
polarized society or whatever the
Yeah.
case might be. But I just worry that instead of being compassionate towards the fact that a fellow human being is going through life and trying to understand, that we immediately jump to conclusions that may vilify another person in a way that, if they had something to offer us, it's not going to be made available now.
No, I think that's really good. And on that note, I want to shift into more interesting theological, philosophical questions. One thing you sort of touched on about your intellect and maybe how that shaped your decisions. Something that I've struggled with is like that balance between faith and reason.
Mm, yep.
And I've always wanted to ask someone who has a lot of background in this, like, how has that influenced your journey in faith, and what are your thoughts on that? Like, how does faith and reason combine? Because a lot of people don't think those two things go together.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I love this question. Second of all, I love it because of my own background, right? So I mentioned earlier that I studied biology at Grand Valley State, and I'll just kind of put it out there right now. I do believe that the greatest proof of God's existence is, in fact, our human bodies. The fact that they do what they do, and we're able to sit here and talk. But at the same time, our bodies are regulating our oxygen saturation and blood flow, and our hearts are doing what they're doing so that our minds can be attentive and our ears can hear. Like, it's miraculous that we're able to be present in this moment and operate with the level of sophistication that we're doing. So, having said that, studying in the science community, it teaches you pretty quickly that there are all types of things that scientists don't fully know or understand. That's the nature of science, right? I have a hypothesis. I'm going to bring this to the lab. We're going to work it through and see what might be possible. So, when it comes to faith and reason, what oftentimes our society prefers, and I think this, interestingly enough, is not unique to our societal reality. Like, we as human beings, we like control. We like that which is known. We like to understand. We don't want to feel out of control or unaware. So, where I think the invitation here, when it comes to faith and reason, is to live, interestingly enough, in the same place that the scientific community also lives on a day-to-day basis, which is, we believe that we know this, but there's always a possibility to know more. All right. So if we kind of move this into the realm of faith, we believe that we know that Jesus is the Son of God, that he called us to follow him, that Jesus' mission and ministry was to preach and proclaim the very love of God the Father and to witness to the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. Now, how that plays out in our lives, I think that's the part that we bring to the lab on a day in and day out basis. That is where the conversations occur, and that's the fruit of prayer and the fruit of the corporal works of mercy, where we go out and we serve those who are homeless and those who have no food and those who are imprisoned, that we allow our faith to become manifest in a society that might not otherwise see even any goodness or any joy or any hope in the world. So to me, faith and reason is essential because it moves us, interestingly enough, as human beings, out of a locus of control, which we prefer, but into a space of humility and trust, which, interestingly enough, is what allows us to be most spiritually alive.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I'm curious, I'm interested, has your experience with the Congregation of the Holy Cross had any important part to play in that, and how you've come to that? I'm also curious, just like how in general, like that your experience with the Congregation of the Holy Cross has informed your faith and how you practice it.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. This podcast is not long enough for me to talk about how Holy Cross has made an impact for me, but I'll mention a couple things. The founder of the Congregation of Holy Cross. Now, here's an interesting little movement. So, actually, the name of the community is Congregation of Holy Cross, and the reason is that it was founded in a place called Saint Croix, France. So interestingly enough, when Father Baz Moreau founded the congregation, he named it after the very city that he was living in. So Saint Croix literally means Holy Cross, and so he called the congregation, which is kind of a group of, and then he called Congregation of Holy Cross. But interestingly enough, for Father Moreau, one of the things that he felt was most critical was that, and I think this is a great witness to where we are today in our, again, I keep referencing kind of the technical society and the fast pace and the whole bit. Father Moreau recognized that for real education to occur, what he called the education of heart and mind, um, for that to occur, you needed to do so in the context of a community, that people needed to feel comfortable enough with each other to be able to share truth, vulnerability, and in doing so allow for growth. So when I think about my own formation as a Holy Cross seminarian and now as a priest, I look back at this 19th century priest, and the vision that he put forth and how it is over 150 years has continued to have an impact on so many wonderful people, not only here in the United States, but in France and in Canada and in Bangladesh and in India and in Chile and in Africa. Like the Holy Cross Fathers, the Holy Cross Sisters, the Holy Cross Brothers, they are actively engaged in this type of ministry of bringing people together, allowing for a community to happen, and in doing so, growth and discovery. And what we believe is that at the end, the terminus of all of that is God. So it really is, when you begin to think about bringing people together in a loving way, it allows for the discovery of that which is most important.
Yeah. As we're approaching the end, one question I really want to ask is, you know, primarily younger people listen to the podcast.
Yeah.
What would you say to someone who maybe they're atheist, maybe they have no idea where their faith
Yeah.
stands,
Yeah.
they have no idea what's happening? What would you tell that person if they wanted to get started somewhere?
Yeah. I would say the beauty of someone who's atheist is that they have thought through these questions at length. There's never been an atheist that I've had a conversation with that's just merely whimsical about being atheist. They've thought through and they very much believe in their position. And the thing I would say is that same curiosity, that same intellectual capacity, should continually remain open to a possibility that perhaps hasn't been thought of or considered. And really that's it. And I go back and I speak this in the most compassionate way possible, because all of us are on a journey and all of us are growing. And this has never been about who's right and who's wrong. This has always been about, can we as a human community help one another? And I believe that as a priest, as a priest that is prayed with and encountered the very person of Jesus in my prayer and in the sacraments, and in others, that I want to be able to share that in the same way that, I always use this image. Like if I saw a great movie, I'd want to be able to talk about it with someone else. I just saw Barbie about a week ago. Like I've been jonesing to talk to someone about this particular movie because I've got so many thoughts and questions. And the same is true about my faith, that it has endured over the arc of the entirety of my life, and to be able to share that in a loving and compassionate way, is really a great gift for me. And so I would say, when it comes to someone who's not necessarily a person of faith and would see themselves as an atheist, one, to know of my respect, because I know that decision does not come lightly and is oftentimes well thought out, and just to simply remain open and curious about the conversation.
Yeah, that's really good. A tradition that I have on the podcast is that I always ask, do you have any book recommendations, any media recommendations, just things that you would just recommend anyone read, look at, think about,
Yep.
research, that you like to give to our listeners?
Yep. And so I have a book that I love, and I just want to, like, if you give me a minute, I will find it for you.
Yep. Yep.
It is, come on, there we go. Okay. This book is called Interior Freedom by Jacques Philippe. I think Interior Freedom names beautifully the movement of what it takes to go from kind of our own internal disposition to one that faces and remains open to who God is and who God is inviting us to be. So Father Jacques Philippe is a Frenchman and just writes beautifully, of course, in English. But like I found that this text is very easy to engage, and it's brief, which is my kind of book, but then allows for just great spiritual insight. So Father Jacques Philippe, Interior Freedom.
Awesome. And how would you recommend, if anyone wants to follow you, stay up to date? What would you, do you have any things you want to
Yeah,
plug?
you can hit me up on the socials. It's Pete CSC on Instagram. That's it, man. I'm one place. I'm not in the multiple
I
locations
love
like
it.
some others are. So Pete CSC on Instagram. And then if you ever wanted to look me up for email, you could just search my name. I work as the director of campus ministry at the University of Notre Dame. I'm pretty easy to find.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining Father Pete. This was amazing.
It was my honor. Thank you.